Hi, it's Harriet. I said I was going to stop in and do a live today. I've been kind of running around and everything's been crazy, and in fact, I'm leaving in a few minutes to go and go to my son's swim meet, yet another one. But I wanted to stop in and do a live, and in addition to do a live, I'm going to try to save this so that I can put it in other groups and that it can be shared, and maybe we can spread the awareness. So, what I really wanted to talk about was asthma and anaphylaxis and the use of epi and things like that. So members of this group know, and since this video is going to be posted other places, I have been a severe asthmatic all my life. As a child, I was prednisone dependent from the ages of 4 to 12. That meant that I took prednisone every single day. I was on theophylline, I was on Intel, I was on Alupent, I was on Atarax, I was on all these medications. I was on sodium cromolyn, I'm trying to think what else I was on. I was on Slobid, which is another type of theophylline. Nothing worked. I would have asthma attacks all the time. Unfortunately, almost weekly, I was in the doctor's office getting multiple shots of epinephrine and another drug called Cephalosporin, which was a long-acting epinephrine. This would happen to me often, not just with a cold. There would be mysterious triggers. There would be who knows why, and we would have no idea why I would suddenly be very tight and not being able to breathe. At that time, yes, I had a nebulizer at home, but they did not treat my asthma with a nebulizer at that time. The nebulizer was kind of like an everyday thing, and if I needed more than a nebulizer, I had to get epi. So epi was basically what I had when I was a child to treat my asthma attacks. Did I have allergies? 100%. Do we know what the allergies were versus let's say, whether I had an asthma attack that was an asthma attack, or did I have an asthma attack that was anaphylaxis? I don't know. It's a murky kind of thing, because all my really bad asthma attacks were treated with epi and multiple shots of epi. I did have a lot of hospitalizations. I was in a tent, and things like that. There's asthma treatment, unfortunately, hasn't necessarily improved. I mean, we still use prednisone as our go-to drug. What has improved are the biologics and the use of inhaled corticosteroids versus an oral steroid. But what I wanted to talk about was this tragedy that happened, and because my group has this rule, I'm not going to go into specifics, but whether or not asthma can cause death on its own. And yes, it can. There are people who exposed to various numbers of triggers. It doesn't have to be only food inhalation. It could be inhalation of a perfume, or so for me, sometimes just thinking because it happened today, going by the smell of tar, or the weather changing, or a cold, a bad viral infection. That's what does me, and most of the time, except for the last couple of weeks, I don't know why I've been coughing and wheezing. I have no idea. Or being someplace that's too dusty or moldy. These can trigger people to have asthma attacks. And believe it or not, you can lose your airway and shut down and stop breathing. And it's not anaphylaxis, it's asthma. And your airways swell and close. And it's not the same thing as anaphylaxis. It's not a multi-system situation where your lips are swelling and your blood pressure is dropping, and or you're vomiting, or you've got hives all over your body. You literally could just lose your airway and stop breathing. And it's not anaphylaxis. So I think we need to make that very clear, that asthma alone kills more people in a year and then anaphylaxis does in about 10 years, according to one study which was done by Yeshiva University. The fact is that poorly controlled asthma has a really negative impact on a food allergy reaction, because your airways are already inflamed, they're already twitchy, they're already spasmatic, so they're like, going late. They're very quick to swell, very quick to swell. And all it does is take that little bit of a trigger, and if there's already inflammation there, that just amps up the inflammation. And, the constriction, which is what an asthma attack is, think about it. Your airways constrict and they become tighter, and you're having difficulty moving air in and out. They fill with fluid, there's inflammation, all this stuff is going on. Now, you can have asthma, and you could never have had anaphylaxis in your life. You could not have a food allergy. But this is still going on. You're still constricting. You're still having a problem. So it's important to know that if you're asthmatic and you're exposed to the many different types of triggers, that, you could lose your airway if you're not under proper control. And that did happen to me. And I, till this day, do not know why I had an attack when I was 12 years old, walking down the street with my friends, and out of nowhere, I suddenly couldn't breathe. And as I wrote, my parents took me to the allergist, and I had about 3 or 4 shots of Epi, and they sent me home. I went to sleep, and I woke up a couple hours later, and I couldn't breathe again. And they gave me more. I went to the pediatrician, and they gave me more Epi, more Suspirin, and finally they said I had to go to the hospital. And the truth was that I remember that feeling of not being able to breathe, and feeling that I was not going to make it, and that I was going to pass out. And I did pass out in triage. So what I'm saying is that that wasn't anaphylaxis, but the same thing happened, and I was intubated, and those things happen with asthma. And you don't always have the ability to control what your trigger is with asthma. And you can't always avoid it. So, I see my mom is watching. Hi. So you can't always avoid what your triggers are. My mom did everything, since she's there watching. She removed the stuffed animals. My house was a completely dust-free zone. I didn't go anywhere. I didn't go to the park. I didn't do this. I didn't do anything, because everything was a trigger for me. But again, this wasn't anaphylaxis. I was needing Epi. So a lot of the questions, when I said today that asthma can be treated with Epi, people were like, wait, what? So here's the deal. Years ago, I guess, I'm trying to think, 35 years ago, they were still using Epi, even more than, I would say 30 years ago, they were still using Epi to treat severe asthma attacks. And they still do. If someone is, in severe respiratory distress. What is interesting, though, is that in all these fatalities, the fatalities have been people with asthmatics who have asthma. And they run for the nebulizer, or they run for the inhaler first. And I'll be honest, I did the same thing in the early days with my kids too. And then I learned, and I actually screamed at a paramedic who started a nebulizer on my son in the ambulance, because he started pointing to his chest when I knew he really needed Epi. Epi treats both. The Epi that was used on me and what is used in the hospital during a crisis is not the EpiPen. It is a drawn-up dose, so you have to actually draw it up. But what I would like to see from the food allergy advocacy groups and the advocates is this conversation about, if you have dual diagnosis, so let's say you have a food allergy and you have asthma, and let's say you were exposed somehow, some shape to your trigger. Perhaps if you see that an inhaler and the nebulizer is not working, or you do it and there's no change, you immediately Epi. Know that you immediately Epi. And the other thing is that if you eat something and then you suddenly have symptoms and you have a problem, you should put two and two together and say, oh, yeah, so if I'm starting to wheeze and I'm having a problem, then I should epi. The thing is that we're not having this conversation that if you're asthmatic, you really, really have to be on top of your game because your airways are going to swell so much faster and they're already inflamed, and it only takes a little bit to send them over the edge. And the conversation that we really need to be having now is that years ago, severe asthma attacks were treated with epinephrine. Is that maybe why we didn't see as many cases of anaphylaxis? Or maybe anaphylaxis was really that and we really didn't see that? Who knows? But we really need to be talking with our providers and saying, look, if I have a severe asthma attack and my nebulizer's not working, what do I do? Should I use the epi? Should I do this? Should I do that? And that conversation's not really happening. I can say that there is some protocols in place that, for example, if I'm using my nebulizer or my kids are using their nebulizer more than, let's say, if they need it more than twice in a row, and if they take it once and then it's not working, or if I need it more than every 4 hours, that's the clue that there's something seriously wrong, and that's when you need to go to the ER. If you take the inhaler or the nebulizer one time and then you're not getting any relief, that's your clue that something else, you need something else on top of that. When they stopped giving me epi, they started giving me round-the-clock nebs. The thing with the nebulizer, so what's important to know is that there is a type of epinephrine inside your albuterol, which is your rescue inhaler. The reason they went away from using epi is because epi is more systemic, so it affects the heart. It affects the B1 and B2 agonists that we have in our lungs and our heart. Whereas the albuterols are just B2 agonists, so really it just stays in the lungs, and while it has maybe a minor effect on the heart, it shouldn't be as, it doesn't affect the system as much. So they felt that this was less taxing, and it is, let's be honest, but you do get palpitations. You can still get palpitations from it, unless, of course, you use Zopronax, which is supposed to have taken it even further, and now that element that gives the palpitations and rapid heartbeat has been removed as well. So Zopronax is kind of like you don't even really feel that. But the truth is, if someone comes in respiratory distress, they're not going to sit there and decide whether it's anaphylaxis or whether it's an asthma attack in the ER. They're going to, they should, if there's a history, they should then proceed and weed out. And if someone's in respiratory distress, they're going to get epi. And then they also might add on something called Somedrol, which they also give. But what's not happening in the community here is that we're not educating ourselves that if you have both, it's safer to give the epi than guess whether an attack is asthma or whether it's anaphylaxis. My mom tells a story how every Friday night I would have an asthma attack and I would end up needing epi. And she couldn't figure out why. The only thing we could figure out is probably something that she was cooking. And I would consistently have an asthma attack. And I'd end up getting epi, multiple shots of epi. But, you don't always know the triggers. And what's really sad in this story is that we don't know if there was an EpiPen prescribed. And the truth is, if one treatment didn't work, then obviously the airway was definitely getting inflamed. And unfortunately, it did say that, they did have a portable nebulizer, which leads me to believe that this was potentially a poorly controlled case of asthma. And we do know that the biggest risk factor is having poorly controlled asthma, which is one of the reasons why it's even harder to do things like OIT and things like that. So I would say, please, 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 please educate yourself, educate your provider, ask your provider, is this something, if your child is asthmatic, is this something that when in doubt, epi, which is what they're probably going to say to do on an action plan, but definitely have that conversation and know that, the epi works for both, whereas an inhaler and a nebulizer treatment does not work for both. So that is something to think about. And again, keep in mind that an asthma response, an asthma reaction is not considered airborne anaphylaxis. Let's just put that out. So be very careful in how you explain to people. I tell people my kids are allergic to milk and other things, but if they're in a room where they're steaming milk, it will bother their asthma and it will cause an asthma attack, potentially a severe asthma attack. So that's how I explain it. If you have any questions or anything, please let me know. I'm happy to help spread the word that, when in doubt, epi, and that epi treats both, and that for years, epi was used to treat severe asthma attacks. All right, thanks. Bye. Trying to